Hello again, and for me it's only a few seconds later, but I don't know how long it takes you to get from one video to another. Indeed, I don't even know when you're going to watch these or what day this will finally get posted. I'm making them now here on the 17th of October, which is actually the 17th night of Halloween Horror Nights 24. And in fact, before this, within a couple of hours from now, I'm going to be in my motor vehicle, zooming across the highways of Florida to reach Universal Studios, going on my own 10th trip to HHN 24 so far this year, and intend to be enjoying immensely the houses, scare zones and shows of that event yet again. Oh, what fun. Yes. But that's Halloween Horror Nights of the present, and indeed, as it hasn't happened yet, the 10th night at least, which is later, a couple of hours from now, that will be the future. And we're not here to talk about the future or even the present. This is a video about Horror Nights history. In order for it to be history, it has to have already happened. And therefore we're going back into the past, once again to the year 2009. Continue with my third video on Horror Nights history for Halloween Horror Nights 19, ripped from the silver screen. Yes, a year which presages some of the more IP heavy events we've been having lately. Yes, rather than the not so IP heavy event of the year before, 2008's Reflections of Fear. Halloween Horror Nights 19 was a rather IP heavy year, the concept being all about the movies. Although some of the houses were originals that still had a movie flavour. In some ways, less obsessive about IPs than current events have been. But fun nevertheless. A good event, and it had an icon. I just got done talking about Julian Browning, the Usher. In the previous video I failed to mention that he carried with him a large flashlight. A very large flashlight like theatre ushers often do. Cinema ushers using them to spotlight where you can go to your seat in the semi-dark so you don't stumble and trip down the stairs and break your neck. Although in Julian Browning's case, he might actually want you to do that, especially if you're disrespecting his lady. That is, of course, his cinema, the Universal Palace Theatre, which he seemed to have a near erotic relationship with. So, did John Money ever coin a paraphilic term for someone who's sexually interested in a building? I'm not sure what that would even be. Never mind, that was just a pondering for those of you who are into categorizing sexual oddities into classes of paraphilia, but most of you don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. Some of them are really weird, and there's always an affinity group on the internet for any of them, even the ones that you'd think you wouldn't find any more than one or two people into it. They find like dozens of people meet together on the websites to meet up with each other because they're all interested in doorknobs or light bulbs or some other weird thing. Anyway, enough of that. just to give you something to do when you're bored. To look up weird stuff, not to actually do those. No. Icky. And if you do, always stay clean up afterwards, right? Ugh, messy stuff. But getting back to it, I mean, how do you do it with a building? I mean, what would be the organs? The men's and ladies' rooms? And does that mean the building's bisexual because it has both? I don't know. Anyway, sorry about that. I just go off on these tangents sometimes when I haven't had my medications. Caffeine can help. Anyway, as I indulge myself in more sinister cat petting, just like Marlon Brando in The Godfather, or, for that matter, Charles Gray, or Telly Savalas, or Donald Pleasance, or whoever the other guy was who played Blofeld. why am I making movie references? It is all about the silver screen, isn't it? That's true, it is. Okay, got you there. Alright. And sometimes rambling madly, I can pick up my train of thought when I've dropped it. What was my train of thought? Something about the Usher. Oh yes, he had that flashlight. In addition to providing illumination, he could also use it to bash you about the cranium, because it was a huge, big, tough-looking flashlight, one of those big mag-light type things that can be used as a weapon, as well as concussive force, as well as being a nice, show you where to go. It can be a bit threatening. Nowhere near as obnoxious as the ushers in the Bill and Ted show, who tell you, no, you cannot do any videotaping of the sexy people. But, of course you want to do that, because you want to remember those sexy people for later. Anyway, let's see. There's the man in question, Julian Browning the Usher. So, here's our lovely icon, and he ushers you into the cinema itself. And it was really cool on the website, where you could see all these different places within the theatre, with these little figurines of the different people, kids and grown people, and posters for all the movies that were the houses and scare zones. But why describe those things when I can describe the actual houses and scare zones? So when the event actually began then, back in September of they don't have the full dates on here. One of these might have it. No. Anyway, whenever it was, I didn't write down how many nights it ran. Considerably less than the 28 nights that it's going this year. It was probably no more than 18, 19 to 20. I'm sure someone on there is probably going to put something in the comments. Or it might have been 22, 23, 24. I'll look it up at some point, but unfortunately I pulled out my old brochures and I thought it might give the full dates, but it really only covers the dates that the brochure was for. This is for. But it did run, as I said, and I think it might have started on September 25th, now that I think about it. It was one of the weekends. I think that was the opening weekend, indeed. And at least, and it was on that opening, on that night then, when you first entered the park, that you discovered the various houses and scare zones. So let's get on with the houses and scare zones. Starting, of course, with those houses located in the sound stages. Here we have a lovely map, which of course is quite backwards. So you might want to flip the screen if you want to see it more correctly. But back then we had 4 houses in three houses in sound stages. 3 houses in sound stages. And I'm looking through my tome to remind me a little bit about some more information. Yes, that's right. Those were the 2 sound stages used that year. Sound stages 22 and 23. Sound stage 22 being used for the 16th house, and sound stage 23 for its 10th and 11th house in the history of the event. Just some trivia there. It was so in soundstage 23 there were 2 houses sharing the soundstage, and they were themed to 2 of the more famous classic Universal monsters of all time. I'm speaking, of course, of Count Dracula and the Frankenstein monster, who of course go back to the very first sound Universal horror films, the one starring Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi in the early, I believe 1930 is when they both came out, or 1930 and 31. Dracula first, then Frankenstein, and they became enormous hits, and this is what really And even though there have been previous horror films from Universal, and especially silent films like The Hunchback and The Phantom of the Opera, these two films really set the ball going for creating the Universal brand, especially with Karloff and Lugosi as its leading iconic stars. So, of course, Frankenstein and Dracula had to be represented in their own houses, but the concept here was an idea that they'd toyed with previously, most notably back in the year 2000 when the idea was to take these old Universal classic monsters and update them for the 21st century. As J. Michael Roddy said back in the year 2000, obviously this was an idea that he hadn't given up on, because in 2009, once again, Roddy, in his last year as the showrunner for Halloween Horror Nights, once again revisited that idea to even amp it further and give Dracula and Frankenstein, for the first time in history, their own houses each, not sharing their houses with each other or with the other classic monsters, but both of them had their own house for the first time, and these houses would amp up the whole concept to modern times in the way that movies that had come out in the 90s, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as created by Kenneth Branagh, or the version of Dracula that was made by Francis Coppola in the 90s, called Bram Stoker's Frankenstein, or even, of course, the newer versions of those monsters that were featured in the Van Helsing film a few years before that, before 2009, which also wasn't quite a huge success, but certainly helped inspire some of the ideas, especially the thing on the chest of the Frankenstein monster in the house here. But they were rather nifty ideas. So the Frankenstein house was called Frankenstein Creation of the Damned. The idea being, and they toyed with the notion of having a steampunk house. The steampunk style had never really been used before at Horror Nights. It was becoming sort of trendy and fun, and they thought, since it takes place, actually, if you really want to be accurate, the Frankenstein novel that everything is based on is actually set not in the 19th century at all, but rather in the 18th century. It takes place in the 1700s in Switzerland, mind you, not Germany or Transylvania. Frankenstein is Swiss. He's not even a doctor. He's a medical student. He's not in the aristocracy, because Switzerland at that time is a democracy. It doesn't have a titled aristocracy. His father is sort of an important person in the community, but he's not a baron. And so he's not a baron or any sort of titled nobility. And furthermore, he doesn't even speak German, he speaks French. He's a French-speaking Swiss. And the monster, who can speak in the novel, also speaks French, amazingly enough. So they're all, and then the whole story that is told by the monster and Victor Frankenstein, Victoire Frankenstein, I suppose be how it would be said, to the sea captain in the story. That whole story would have been translated from the French by the sea captain in Mary Shelley's original novel. That's Frankenstein trivia for those of you who've not actually read the book. No one's ever really done that as the movie in any adaptation, because Universal changed it to Henry Frankenstein, Heinrich Frankenstein, back in 1930, made him clearly a German, or they didn't really put the name on it, but in one of the films, I think it's Bride, you can actually see the red, white, black, old-fashioned striped German flag in the town of Karnstein, where the castle was located, and you realize he's a German, clearly a German in the movie, because that's a German flag they're showing, and a baron and an actual doctor, not just a medical student. And so most Frankenstein films that have come afterwards have been based more on the 1930 Universal film than on the novel, because they keep all of those elements. That he's either from Transylvania or Germany, he's a baron and doctor. So the Hammer films and other adaptations that are supposed to be independent adaptations of the novel actually are taking all kinds of stuff from Universal, where they first came up with all of that. And I've run out of time again. And I've just stopped it on Frankenstein. Ugh. This is typical of my long-windedness, isn't it? Oh well.